Hello, my name is Jackie Huggins and I'm the co-patron of Reconciliation Queensland. This week is National Reconciliation Week. It's also the 20th anniversary of the bridge walks over Sydney Harbour Bridge and other parts of Australia. Those bridge walks were the largest gatherings and marches in Australia. So that speaks volumes for the support that non-Indigenous people gave to us on that very cold day in May as we walked across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The theme for this week is In This Together. And we are very much in this together still, some 20 years later. There are 5 dimensions to reconciliation, and we will have an eminent panel speaking to those 5 dimensions this week. We hope that you will enjoy them just as much as I will this week. I'd like to now introduce Morris Serico, who will do the official acknowledgement to country.
Good afternoon and wanya, ladies and gentlemen. Today's web seminar will be on the topic of equality and equity. These are burning issues for the First Nations community of Queensland. I would like to acknowledge those First Nations communities of our glorious state. I would also like to pay my respect to the elders of those communities, past, present and emerging, and also let them know that we feel for them for any sorry business that is taking place in those communities today. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Uncle Bill Buchanan and our eminent panel for today's discussion.
Let's talk equality and equity. The State of Reconciliation in Australia report defines the equality and equity dimension as a state in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians participate equally and equitably in all areas of life, and the distinct individual and collective rights and cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are universally recognised and respected. Developing an understanding of this dimension can be strengthened by examining the distinct contexts and meanings and measures of the concept of equality compared to equity, all the while recognising the ways in which the two are mutually reinforcing. Within the State of Reconciliation in Australia report, equality is defined as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples being in control of their life choices, enabling them to participate fully in social, cultural and economic opportunities enjoyed by the wider Australian community. Unfortunately, as equality stands today, it is clear that Australia is falling far short of providing equal life opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Large and unacceptable gaps continue to exist between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous Australians across all social, health, educational and economic indicators. Statistics show that due largely to the intergenerational impacts of Australia's unjust colonial history, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are more likely to consider their living conditions as worse than other peoples. They are also more likely to experience higher rates of preventable diseases and be subject to lower life expectancy. They are more likely to face barriers to employment and education. In response to the 2005 Social Justice Report, targeted government investment programs through the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, such as closing the gap in Indigenous disadvantage framework, are working to address Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inequality by aiming to close the gap in life expectancy within a generation. By 2031, halve the gap in mortality rates for Indigenous children under 5 by 2018. Ensure access to early childhood education for all Indigenous 4-year-olds in remote communities by 2013. Halve the gap in reading, writing and numeracy achievements for children by 2018. Also, halve the gap for Indigenous students in Year 12 or equivalent attainment rates by 2020. Halve the gap to employment outcomes between Indigenous and other Australians by 2018. And finally, close the gap in school attendance by the end of 2018. These kinds of significant long-term and targeted efforts, particularly when designed and delivered in strong partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, are necessary to ensure that all Australians have full, equal and culturally appropriate access to life opportunities. Accordingly, and although there is still a long way to go, health, education and economic outcomes for Australia's First People have begun to improve over recent years, providing optimism for achieving equality.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Joel, look, everyone, we've just got a problem. We haven't got any audio at all. We've got a problem here. There's no audio. So
Again?
I'm just wondering if we might just get the audio sorted out. So if you just be patient with us, is that okay? Thanks.
You can't hear me now, Uncle Bill?
Okay, Joel, just wondering if we have audio.
Please leave a short message.
Just hold on there, folks. We'll just...
Good now. Hello.
I can hear you pretty good.
I'll just unmute.
Am I back, Uncle
I
Bill?
think we should be able to start again. It's all good. I think we're fine. We had sorry to everyone there. We had a bit of a technical issue. Our sound went off for a while, and we're back on again now. What we might do is I might start again, if that's okay, and I'll quickly get our panelists introduced. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you've been with us for a little while, apologies for the technical sort of problems that we're having this morning. I'd like to introduce our panel: Maria Marbo, Libby Ferrari, and Gavin Arquette. Maria, you're from Cairns, from Yeti. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, thanks?
So my name's Maria Marbo. I'm a Meriam woman from the Peer Drum clan. Currently I live in Cairns and I work for Yeti, which is a youth drug and alcohol service working with vulnerable young people in Cairns. And I've been with Yeti for about 9 years now. And yeah.
Thanks, Maria. Libby, you join us from BHP in Brisbane. You've been with the company for quite a while.
I have been. I hope you can hear me now. Yes, so my name's Libby. Lovely to see everybody and everybody on the feed. I live in Brisbane. I have 4 lovely children and a husband. And as Uncle Bill said, I work for BHP and have done so for actually over half of my life. I said that I lived in Brisbane now, but I was born on Wiradjuri country many years ago and have moved around with my family pretty much all over the country. So I've been lucky to do that growing up as a child and very, very lucky to be able to do that in my career as well. So really pleased to be here.
Thank you, Libby. And Gavin, you're in Cairns. You've been with Access Housing for quite a while, and you know, I know that you do a lot of community work there around housing.
Yeah, I've been here at Access Housing now for going on nearly a couple of years, but I've been in the housing and homelessness sector in Cairns for most of my adult working life, working somewhere in the community sector. Yeah, born in Innisfail. On my mother's side, Wanyi Kukuyaraji. On my father's side, Kukuyimiza and Yidinchi. So bit of a mix there from a wide area. My mother was born and bred on Palm Island, so I got strong connection to there as Maria has too. Yeah, so I guess reconciliation is very important to us, and looking to, in my position, working with a housing organisation, health and housing for Aboriginal people are very intricately linked. So while we're not a Closing the Gap organisation, hope that our organisation can contribute to the process.
All right, look, thank you, Gavin. Look, with our panellists today, we're going to tackle, I suppose, this topic of equality and equity as a dimension of reconciliation. And importantly, for Queensland here, we've been on this path with equality and equity as the rest of Australia has been since 1975, when with the Racial Discrimination Act, and probably on this path for the last 230 odd years, 250 odd years, as a nation striving, I suppose, to have a more equitable and just society for our people here in Australia. However, we're not there yet. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're going through a process of reconciliation here, particularly for our First Nations people. Look, and we do, one of our former social justice commissioners, Dr. William Jonas, he actually, I suppose, described equality and equity in these terms. And I might actually just read a quote from Dr. Jonas, because it's worthwhile. We might come back to this later in the broadcast and have another look at this particular aspect of equality and equity in this dimension. He says, for Indigenous peoples to participate in Australian society as equals requires that we be able to live our lives free from assumptions by others about what is best for us. It requires recognition of our values, cultures, and traditions so that they can coexist with those in mainstream society. It requires respecting our difference and celebrating it within the diversity of the nation. So if you think about, what Dr. Jonas is saying here, it really, I suppose, is incumbent upon the dominant cultures within Australia to actually accept and respect the Indigenous peoples and their role and their position within the broader Australian nation. But we'll come back and we'll have a look at this a little later. What I'd like to do, you mentioned, Gavin, about not being part of closing the gap with your organisation, and that's been a really big preoccupation of our country around equality and equity in the last 15 to 20 years, has been closing the gap. And we continually hear that that isn't necessarily happening as quickly as we could. Oxfam, is an organisation that's been working and monitoring the Closing the Gap program for the last 20 odd years. And they recently released publicly on their website and on a YouTube a video that actually tried to encapsulate some of the problems and some of the challenges we've got in closing the gap. So what we might do is we might actually take a moment to look at that, and we'll actually then, as a panel, we might actually discuss that in the context of Queensland and where we're going at the moment. So let's have a look at this video.
Since the landmark referendum in 1967, the fight for equality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been long and relentless, weighed down by the injustices of our nation's history. The hope for genuine change has often been met with the disappointment of empty promises.
We apologise.
The year was 2008, and on February 13th, Mr. Rudd made a formal apology to Australia's First Peoples, acknowledging the shame and harm of the stolen generations.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry.
It was an apology that was long overdue and gave hope for the future. The Prime Minister's statement declared a vision to close the gap on health and life expectancy for Australia's First Peoples. In 2008, the Council of Australian Governments committed $4.6 billion towards that vision. All across Australia, communities banded together to close the gap.
It's not about us as a mainstream health service going into a community and saying, this is what we want you to do. It's about, let's work together.
Organisations rose to the challenge, committed to making change happen in our lifetime.
When the Prime Minister announced that they were going to do a progress report on the Close the Gap commitments, the Close the Gap Steering Committee decided that we would also pull together an independent report which would shadow the government's report. The Steering Committee thought it was very important to get the advice and expertise from the people which work on the ground in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. The report found that it's still a long way to go to live up to these commitments.
We advocated for community-owned and run health services to improve health outcomes for our First Peoples.
One of the challenges is always going to be getting it right at the local level. listening to the different needs at local areas. Like, it's not about having one size fits all.
Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people came together to close the gap.
It's really vital that we do have our non-Aboriginal health workers in our mainstream service gaining an understanding of what it takes to maintain that partnership. From little things, big things grow. And it's happening right here.
We have strived to reach the bright future that Rudd envisioned.
A future where we harness the determination of all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to close the gap that lies between us and life expectancy, educational achievement and economic opportunity.
But after 10 years of striving, that future remains out of reach.
What I would hate to see is the issue of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health falling to the back burner, to governments not being interested anymore, to the public, getting a little bit fatigued with what is obviously a really difficult situation. It's not just a fad or an issue that's important now, it's something that matters to communities because it's their people's lives.
What we'd like to see from government is a commitment with Close the Gap Within a Generation, that it remains front and centre for the next 20 years. It needs to have a very focused approach and it needs to be relevant to the communities which it is actually designed to improve their health for.
Our governments are failing Australia's First Peoples. Since 2008, when the government first set targets to close the gap, only 3 of the 7 targets are on track. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders have expressed bitter disappointment at worsening health indicators. We must demand that governments work closely with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations to redesign the strategy, ensuring that it's sustainably resourced and followed through. In the decade since our government first pledged to close the gap on Indigenous health and life expectancy, the gap has only grown bigger. Our work is not yet done.
That is it really is quite a challenge that we've got in terms of closing the gap as a nation ahead of us. And it's been a challenge for the last 20 years. However, things have changed and things have been moving on. I might actually ask Libby, can you share with us, I suppose, some of the things that are happening around employment and procurement that you're aware of? I know BHP is one of the Elevate RAP organisations in Australia, and you've been doing quite a lot of work there along with all of the other RAP organisations, about 1,000 RAP organisations. Libby.
Sure. Thanks, Uncle Bill. So I guess, organisations broadly speaking across the nation have a big role to play here, I think. And in terms of the topic that we're talking about today, clearly some of the big ways that organisations in the country can impact in a positive way are through providing real jobs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and also supporting Aboriginal businesses as well. And as you said, that's a big part of what particularly mining in this country can do and are definitely doing. So Supply Nation, which BHP is signed up to, we have, as you said, an Elevate Reconciliation Action Plan. And I think really the key there, Bill, is to make sure that we are talking about tracking and monitoring how we're performing in that space, because if you're not doing that, it's easy to kind of forget about and kind of drops to the back of the line. So we have around 1,600 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees that work for BHP across the whole country. So that's in our coal business here in Queensland, New South Wales, and our big iron ore business, obviously, in WA. And I think that's something that we're very proud of, and the contribution that each of those employees make to the company and the culture of the company is really important.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Libby. There's, I suppose, in thinking about that, in terms of equality and equity, big organisations like BHP have a major role to play in, providing those opportunities for people to participate in the economy, particularly equitably, and equally. And I do know that, those are some of the key issues, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We still have the highest levels of poverty, I suppose, of any of the groups in Australian society, and our household incomes are really quite low. So it's important, and the role that groups like BHP play are major, initiatives where, you actively encourage Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to come and work with BHP, as many other companies do. Now, I believe also the governments have very actively promoted this program across all sectors. So that's an important element of equality and equity, is that commitment that we make. But look, in the housing sector, though, Gavin, I mean, it's not necessarily the case, is it? I mean, the home ownership levels of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is very low, and very difficult to get housing as well, isn't it?
It is. The story of home ownership being a struggle for Aboriginal people is not a new one. So that's been going on for a while, and there are more things tied up with that, with pathways to economic independence that may achieve something like home ownership. So when you take 10 steps back, there are issues there regarding access and equity and equality. It's difficult with housing is, I guess they're improving the area of equality by giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people access to housing. But without the acknowledgement of the structure of Aboriginal families and communities, sometimes it clashes with tenancy law in particular states with regards to the makeup of the household and extended families, and sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes 4 generations living in one household. Under your generic tenancy law, a lot of that's unacceptable because of the levels of wear and tear on the house and other things. So while there's equality and access to housing, there could be a little bit more done about around equity and how Aboriginal people in housing are supported, you could say, to sustain tenancies. That's what the goal is, a sustainable tenancy, so they're not exited into homelessness or other temporary accommodation. So I guess, and with regards to closing the gap, I think all the experts in the closing the gap field have acknowledged that housing is foundational to closing the gap for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Without a stable home environment, it becomes difficult to achieve in those other areas of your life. What we would call social determinants are very much impacted in those other areas of your life. So yeah, I feel very privileged to be in a position I'm in here. And one thing we're trying to do is to link with community health services and Aboriginal medical services to develop a model around healthy housing for Aboriginal people. And what is that? What does that constitute? And how does that play out? So, you know, we're on that little road at the moment. I'm trying to get, not only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, for people from non-English speaking backgrounds as well, who have very similar barriers to access and equity for anything in Australia.
Well, look, thanks, Gavin. It's interesting there that you mentioned that you're now working with health and other areas, and this is part of the need. We need to do things differently. It hasn't worked for the last 20 years. We're aware of that. Each year we have the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition give us the state of the nation in terms of closing the gap, and it has been consistently difficult for them to do that. I think the only place we've really achieved that is in sort of early childhood participation and attendance, and now in school attendances. And so that's been an incredibly important step for our younger people as well. And it's probably a good segue for Maria. Maria in terms of youth and the whole issue of equity and inequality matters that sort of for youth, because they're in a particularly difficult position economically as well. And they also live in these extended family arrangements with our people in our homes and our housing. So, Maria.
Yeah, I think from a youth perspective, equality and equity, I know with young people, they already come with that stigma of being a young person, and then adding, discrimination against their cultural background or identity adds to that, and it can have a great effect on their mental health. They create negative self-views of themselves and really make them feel undervalued, worthless, and disempowered, which is really sad. Like working with young people, you can see examples when taking young people to, say, for example, the shop or the bank, and walking in, you can already see people's guards going up and, looking at that young person as if, oh, you shouldn't be here, you don't belong here, what are you doing here, kind of thing. And I think that, we need to, support our young people and support other people to reframe their lens that they're looking at these young people through, a more accepting, more understanding, more respecting lens, I think.
Well, you raise an interesting proposition there as well, and that I suppose is the interconnectedness of these dimensions of reconciliation, like race relations and the way that people, tend to view Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people quite differently as other Australians, for example. And that can be really difficult at times when, and I know as an Aboriginal person myself, it's hard when you're just striving to just be a normal member of society and sort of, provide for your family. Even though we may have culturally different ways of doing it, it can be quite challenging when others might perceive what we're doing as being, something that is not quite acceptable to them. So, and I know with our youth that can be, equally can play, and with youth, I do know that, mental health is quite a real issue when it comes to, when we're talking about equality and equity and how our youth are actually coping. You're in Yeti in Cairns, and you deal a lot with youth there. What's happening there in terms of youth and our mental health issues around equality and equity?
I think definitely one of the issues is their contact within institutional structures, so courts, child protective services, things like that. I think there's a real equality and equity issue when young people and their families are having contact with these government institutions, and some of the language that's used and some of the contact with families might not be as culturally safe for these young people. So there's language barriers and not understanding the family network and things like that can make it hard for these young people and their families when trying to navigate service systems and navigate like contact with the courts or child safety, things like that as well. And then I think part of that institutional inequality comes, and the lack of recognition for past injustices and our intergenerational trauma. I think that leads to things like substance misuse and things like that, and which leads to courts and family protective services and things like that.
Cycle,
yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, look, it's one of those things I think which we experience, and we all know we're sort of in, regardless of whether we may live in an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander household, or a house just the average Australian household, the challenges for youth are incredibly, particularly in society today, with our challenges economically, and the COVID virus at the moment obviously is providing us with particular challenges as we move forward. I think it's somewhere that we need, in this whole process of reconciliation, to really consider the impact it's having on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth, who may not be, they're only a small minority of the Australian population, but can be significantly impacted. As do our elders, I might add, our elders in this particular time, and in terms of equality and equity, if we think about our lives, in terms of our elders, we're less likely to live as long as others, and so forth. So there are more challenges that sit in around that as well. And the other thing is employment is always a major issue in that. But having said that, equality and equity is a lot more than just looking at employment and housing and those sorts of things. It's also got a lot to do with education, and it'd be and I think it's important we might actually have a look at how that might contrast. I know, Gavin, with the work that you do with many of your clients there, that education and access to education sometimes can also be a major issue as well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I'm currently involved with another group called FANCL, First Nations Council of Elders and Leaders through CQ University, which BHP has a bit to do with. And a part of this group is looking at strategies for engagement for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in not only education but higher education, and also into employment within those institutions. A big barrier we have in our houses for access to education and training and employment is the multitude of social issues that Maria touched on there before too. They're all institutional issues that are determined by, they're impacted by legislation. And it's very difficult to change the way you want to work with people around that when the legislation sometimes needs to change. There's a lot that can be done for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think educational institutions are starting to become more, what could you say? They're trying to create more culturally safe environments for people to learn in. Yeah. So that's, I guess, the more that progresses, I guess there'll be more recognition of these social determinants that are barriers to achieving education. But if you go further back again, back in the time, Uncle Bill, you'd probably be able to elaborate this on even more, back in the time when blackfellas weren't allowed to go to school and were denied education like that. So it's not like this, it's been a new thing, it's been a progressive thing. And we're going to be spending a generation or two backtracking to try to right the wrongs, sort of thing. But we need our mob inside them institutions teaching our mob with that understanding that goes with it.
And I think you touched there, Gavin, on an important aspect of, or an element that has been not just recognised here in Australia, but around the world, is the issue of cultural safety, and not just with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or Indigenous peoples, but with all cultural groups. Yeah. And the issue of cultural safety is one that, particularly here in Queensland, I think it's challenging for our schools, our businesses, our small businesses particularly, to look at how they can actually conduct their businesses in a more culturally safe way. And I don't think we've really done enough to really look at the economic benefits of actually being culturally safe versus being culturally unsafe. And it's probably from an education perspective, one of the things that our tertiary institutions maybe need to do more research on. And I find in terms of equality and equity and race relations generally, there isn't a lot of dedicated research happening in that field. here as a nation. And it's something that, as we move forward, particularly as we have less manufacturing and where the sort of, our mining, coal and stuff begins to wane off, and there's more challenges on us to be the smart country, the one that's actually more about capturing this wave of, working online and being online, that we really need to have better information around that stuff, particularly cultural safety. Cultural safety, by the way, is an important aspect of work in most workplaces already, and it's like workplace health and safety. I know at BHP, Libby, there is a great lot. You've done a lot of work in this area already today. Maybe you can enlighten us on some of that.
Yeah, sure. And look, I think I'd preface these comments by saying that we are doing things, but there's so much more that we need to do, and we need to get a lot better than what we currently are. And I think, I would speak openly about that as a person that works for a company in this country. But I think as a nation, we need to confront that a bit too. So, look, I think that the role of education more broadly is really interesting, and in corporations like mine, we strive to make sure that we're providing the tools that we can. We've got 26,000 people that work for the company in Australia, so that's a lot of people to train up and educate. I think we've moved on from the days of an online training package being enough to educate our broader workforce on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, where we're finding the greatest wins are when people on country to experience for a few days the strength of Aboriginal people, of their culture, of connection to country. When you can show people that, they don't forget it, and it kind of almost, you can see it turn in a few seconds in people's minds when they get the opportunity to actually be exposed in a meaningful way to the amazing culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I think more and more that's where we will be heading as a company, but as a country, that's where we've got to get to as well, because I think in terms of equality and equity, we're only just starting to get our heads around what equality means, let alone, the difference between that and true equity between the people that live in this country. And just one little example I'd really love to share that Maria reminded me of was this institutional, the issues around institutional, the differences there is, I don't think there's a great appreciation in, the whole nation, but particular sectors as well, around what, the cultural differences are. And one really wonderful thing I've seen, it's an WA example, but where one of the traditional owner groups there brought the whole police force out on country for 4 days and did the same thing that I was explaining that we're trying to do as a company. And I think, those individuals walked away from that experience with a completely different understanding, because, that they were hearing stories from those people that were saying, we could sit there and have a judgment put against us and wouldn't really even be able to understand what it is. That's not our first language. We didn't kind of comprehend what was going on there. So I think that there is such a massive role in non-Indigenous Australia to play in educating ourselves and understanding deeply, the culture of Aboriginal people. So that's where I think we all need to focus.
Look, it's interesting. The whole issue about equality and equity is sometimes it's very hard for people to actually, I suppose, really appreciate what that is. I know that we do have, for many years, there's been a cartoon around about equality and equity that, has been, one that we've, has been quite useful. And I might just sort of, see if we can get that up now and just have a bit of a look at that, because it really does, I think, encapsulate, one of many of the challenges we have around equality and equity. So we might just have a look at that now. Okay. All right. So when we probably need to think about what's happening in this particular sort of image here. But we can see, essentially that, everyone having a crate to stand on doesn't necessarily, or everyone having an equal share doesn't necessarily mean an equitable share. And I suppose it's very important that when we think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, it's not just about having an equal opportunity to have a job, but an equitable opportunity. And equity does mean, I think today we've begun to unpack that a bit, that there are some real challenges around the equity side of the equation, not so much the equal. It's very easy sometimes to give everyone an equal share, but an equitable share is quite a different proposition. I don't know, Maria, in terms of youth and our young people today, that's really quite a challenge, isn't it? An equitable share versus an equal share.
Yeah, I think that I think what then maybe needs to be a little bit more of is an understanding that there are some groups of people that need a little bit more to be equal because they're already at a disadvantage. And I think for our young people, more awareness about things, why certain things are the way they are, why there are certain behaviours because of trauma that's carried through. But I think definitely, I think the people understanding that certain groups are already at a disadvantage to the others. There's we've been running focus groups and workshopping with our staff at Yeti around reconciliation and developing our next RAP. And one of the really beautiful things that someone said was, I was born with privilege. My grandparents had a house that my parents inherited and I'm going to inherit. And he basically acknowledged that, yes, he's got a lot of privilege in his life, but he thinks that it's important for everyone to know that we may be born with these privileges and be blessed with things, but other people may not. And I just thought that was a really beautiful statement. I think for me describe this picture to me in words.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say about privilege, because we do have privileges, whether we're part of a dominant culture or any cultural group. We have privileges as a member of that cultural group that others who are outside of the group may not have. And the same way as those privileges may or may not extend to, if you're a younger person in that group or an older person, there are different privileges which are at play. And I think that really sort of augurs into that, to what Gavin was talking about, the cultural safety element, is to really understand that we do have these privileges at times. And one of the things that we tend to have a lot of is we tend to have unconscious bias at times. We're not aware that we have privileges sometimes, and we think we're sort of reacting in a situation with someone, and we've got our own biases at play, and so that can be really difficult. And I think one of the challenges for many of our businesses and our people working in our public institutions, our hospitals and schools, and working in our community organisations, in our sporting bodies, and with our local, country and rural associations, is that we need to be mindful of the need to be open to others and be more inclusive, and not just sort of take our privileges for granted, but to maybe look at how that comes in. Look, equality and equity is an interesting proposition for us, and I think we've had an opportunity today to have a look at that in a couple of ways, around some of the more commonly known closing the gap sort of areas. But in the context of equality and equity in reconciliation, and I think about that, reconciliation as that particular word, reconciliation, the big element of that is conciliation. So, and that means that we, in terms of our own groups, our First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and bear in mind in Queensland here, we have both the Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander peoples. We are unique and quite distinctive and quite different in our cultural perceptions of life, our worldviews, our values, as well as the rest of the Australian society. So it's an opportunity, I think, with reconciliation for us to conciliate amongst our groups as well as around those 5 dimensions, things like race relations and things like how do we deal with equality and equity, as First Nations people. And then also for non-Indigenous people to also conciliate those positions around that. Reconciliation is a process that we need to engage in. So having said that, it'd be interesting, Gavin, I know apart from your working in the housing, you're certainly an active member in the Cairns community as well, and been there for quite a long time. Just and around sporting areas and stuff like that, there is already a lot being done around equality and equity, isn't there?
Yeah, there are, and that's nationwide too. You have the thing like Indigenous round, so you get some teams up here doing that too in the other sports locally. But the equality and equity, I guess, what's the easiest way to explain it? I'm trying to be careful what I say here too. But for years in Cairns here, I come from an extended family that was very much involved in the struggle for Aboriginal land rights and other things. And I've grown up working in that environment and being influenced by a lot of those things, which is what I'm very appreciative of, has given me a hard edge to dealing with some of this stuff. I've seen it go forwards and backwards here over many years. It was bad back in the early 80s, 70s, as you would know. Then come through that period of self-determination in the late 70s, early 80s, and the struggle for land rights and all of this. And then there was more Aboriginal Islander people were getting access to education, to schools, to good education as well. And then towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, you had this movement of self-determination, where we set up all our own organisations to the point where we had ATSIC, our own supposedly political body, government body. And then ATSIC got demolished. A lot of the services that were funded by ATSIC to deal with Aboriginal Islander people were defunded. A lot of services become mainstream. So while you're seeing it come good, you're seeing it go through the other hand, so to speak. Came in one hand and went out the other hand. And that's how it feels on the ground sometimes in communities, where the government will have an inquiry or national inquiry over something, then they'll put all this injection of funds or programs into something, then that dies with the next election and sort of things like that. So there's too much, and that's because Aboriginal Islander Affairs is used as an election tool for a lot of people.
Oh, and that can be a challenge, Gavin, I know. One of the things I know in the Uluru statement that, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have certainly made very clear is that rather than having the politicians always being our voice, so to speak, and determining what's best for us, and we seem to be one government might do this and another that, is that we are looking for our own voice in the Australian Parliament, and as we move forward, as other countries such as in New Zealand with the Maori voices that are in the New Zealand Parliament and others. And so these are some of, I think, some of the bigger questions maybe that sit around equality and equity that go way beyond just people's own individual circumstances, but our circumstances in society as well. I know, Libby, when we were, all of this was happening, and Gavin gave us a very good understanding there, I suppose, a bit of the history of what was happening in Aboriginal affairs and some of the key things that impacted us. But look, in Australia, when you were growing up, as a young girl and as a teenager, and then finally working in a senior role with BHP. You've seen some rather interesting perspectives and changes from that side of it as well. Yes.
I have. I think, I mentioned at the start that I grew up and was lucky, I think, to move around the country quite a bit. So I saw all different states, all different communities. My dad was a geography teacher, and I went on to study environmental sciences. So that's my actual qualification. And my whole life it's been really obvious how people and country, go together. It's kind of one thing. And so I think that it was almost a bit of a natural conclusion that I would end up in a role like I'm in. But I think, observing particularly race relations, I suppose. And, Gavin made a comment that made me giggle, but it's really serious in that, like, sometimes you sit here and think I've got to be a bit careful about what I say. Maybe we need to stop doing that and start having these conversations really frankly. And I think that, we all know that there's racism still in this country, racism still in organisations and society more broadly. And I think that until we start to really understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, that will not go away. So that's one big passion of mine, is the very, little that I have got to see of Aboriginal culture has made me realise how significant that it is, and how every single Australian needs to understand that a lot better. And I think we'd be in a completely different place. And I think the Uluru Statement, and BHP publicly supported the Uluru Statement, as did many other individuals and companies in the country, was a very modest ask, in my view. I think, it was saying we want to say in the matters that affect us, and we think our voice is the right voice to listen to. And I don't know how much more modest an ask there could be than that. So I hope we move on that.
A little later in the week, we're actually going to have Thomas Mayer from who's been championing the Uluru Statement nationally, joining us in the Unity website as well. Listen, we might have to sort of wrap up our conversation before we go, but it's been great talking to you all. I think you've got some interesting perspectives that have come in there about some of the key elements of equality and equity. But before we go, I'd like to ask you each, is there one thing that you see, you're passionate about or concerned about with equality and equity that we can deal with right now as we move to reconciliation? So bearing in mind at some point in the future we are going to be a reconciled nation and be living beyond that. So as part of a unified vision, what would be the one thing that would encapsulate that for you as an equitable and a nation committed to equality and equity? And I might start off with Maria, particularly from our youth perspective, Maria.
So for me, like Gavin and Libby touched on, education and awareness to promote respect and challenge racism, I think for me is really important. And I believe that if we all have a responsibility to educate each other, and I think if we can do that, then we'll move towards being a reconciled country a lot sooner.
Thanks, Maria. Gavin, what would you see, brother, as one of the clear things as a reconciled nation that we need to address, I suppose, now if we're going to be reconciled around equality and equity?
I couldn't agree more with what Maria just said. It's all about education and mutual education, and just with a little bit of dignity and respect that goes with that. But education is the key, and just educating each other, general awareness. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Libby?
I would have to agree with my esteemed panel members, I think. And for me, it's about education, but it's about truth. So unless we confront the truth of the nation and lots of terrible things, some good things, but unless we confront that, we are operating on shaky foundations. So we've got to get that straight first.
Well, look, thank you all. And there you have it. We have, I suppose, from our panel members today, clearly education and the fact that we need individually and I suppose as a society to educate ourselves more about what we need to do to become a reconciled nation is a good first step. And look, hopefully this webinar series and this particular webinar on equality and equity today has been a useful beginning on that journey to understanding the dimension of equality and equity as part of our reconciliation process. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll look forward. Tomorrow we have our next webinar, on Monday, the 1st of June, our next webinar will deal with institutional integrity, where we'll look at essentially RAPs, or as they're known, Reconciliation Action Plans, known as RAPs, in schools and in organisations, and importantly, the need for our institutions to look at itself as we move to reconciliation. What do they need to do to be able to sustain reconciliation for us? So until then, we'll leave you with these thoughts, and that is that reconciliation is everyone's business, and just like the coronavirus, we're all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed the topic, and thank you for your support. And hopefully you would have learnt many things out of this, many lessons to take home, to work within your families, your communities, your businesses, your organisations. It's all very important that we spread the word of reconciliation. So until next time, be safe on our journey together in reconciliation, because as this theme for this week implies, we are in fact in this together. Thank you.